Hello and welcome back to my channel. A few years ago I filmed a very long Q&A about the University of Leeds, and I thought now that I've finished university I would do an updated one because I filmed the last one when I was in my first year of uni, so I couldn't talk about things like housing in your second and third year, my study abroad year, all things that I have since done. And I know a lot of you have either firmed the University of Leeds already or are weighing up your options for where to go to uni, so I hope that this can help. I'm gonna follow a very similar structure to the last Q&A that I did, so grouping similar questions together, and this is probably going to be a very long video, but I'll divide it up into chapters so you can just skip to whatever you want to know about, whether that's accommodation, the city. Just for some context though, before we start, I study business management, so unfortunately I can't answer any questions about any other courses because I simply do not have the knowledge or the information to hand, and please bear in mind that because of that, everything that I'm saying is kind of coming from the perspective of a business student. I am also from the UK as well, so I did an internal application or whatever it's called to the University of Leeds. I wasn't coming as an international student or anything like that, so unfortunately I also don't know anything about the process of applying as an international student. I also applied for student finance and funded my university degree that way, so I don't know any information about scholarships or access schemes or bursaries, anything like that. You can find all of that information on the University of Leeds website, and even if you're looking generally, I would still really encourage you to have a look at Leeds website and their social media because there'll be so much more information on there than I can give you. The information that I can provide is just experiences and knowledge that I've acquired from my personal experience, and everyone's experience will be different, so please bear that in mind. But I thought a good question to start on was, why did you choose Leeds? So I applied for uni, it must be 5 years ago now. That's actually crazy to say, and if I remember rightly, the way that I did it was I firstly compared courses online, and then I went to the open days of the ones that I had kind of shortlisted, and the open days is what I completely based my decision on. So I would really encourage you, if you can, to go to an open day, because the reason that I then chose Leeds wasn't really because of what it said on the website, but because when I came to the open day I just got a very good vibe from it, and compared to other open days that I'd been to, I could just see myself living in Leeds. It felt like the right fit for me, and the life that I now live and have lived in Leeds is exactly what I imagined it to be like, whereas when I was at other university open days I couldn't quite see myself there as much. What I also loved about Leeds in comparison to other unis is the location of the campus. I liked that there was still a campus element to it, and when you're at university you really feel like you're at a university, if that makes sense. Like, all of the buildings are clustered together and you're surrounded by students, and it's got a very campus feel. But then if you walk 15 minutes down the road you're in the city centre, so it doesn't feel like an isolated campus. The second question, and probably the most frequently asked question that I get, is what's the first year accommodation like? There's been a lot of development in Leeds since I first started, so there's loads of accommodations now that I had just never heard of before, and I also haven't visited all of them, so please bear that in mind. But I got a list up on the university website, so I thought I would just skim through and tell you what I know about them all. So I was in one called Montague Burton, and not many people had heard of this when I first started, but I think it's since become a more popular accommodation. But it's literally like a 10-minute walk away from uni, and for the price that you pay, it is so good. I literally could not fault it. It's a bit of a smaller accommodation, and you either have flats of 4 people or 9 people, but the vibes are great. You have a washing machine in the kitchen, which is just unheard of for a student accommodation. So I would recommend that one, but I think it is quite hard to get into. Across the road from Montague Burton, you have one called Leodis, and one of my friends, Freya, lived in Leodis, so we went over there quite often for prees and stuff. And I'd say it's very similar to Montague Burton. The only difference is that in Leodis you have ensuite bathrooms, whereas in Monty B, which is Montague Burton, you have shared bathrooms. All the flats have shared bathrooms. So Leodis is a bit more expensive than Monty B, but very similar vibes and pretty much the exact same location. Next we have Lupton, and Lupton is where Sid actually stayed in his first year of uni, and this accommodation is closer to Headingley. It's just off Headingley High Street, so it's a nice location in that sense, and I'd say it's about a 20 to 30 minute walk to uni, depending on how fast you walk. And Lupton is one of the, if not cheapest, accommodation, I think. But the only thing I'd say is I feel like you kind of get what you pay for with Lupton. It's one of the few accommodations I've seen at Leeds that has a single bed, for example, whereas most of the other accommodations have a small double. And at least the block that Sid was in wasn't very updated. I don't think it's been renovated in a while, but from what I've heard, it is a very social accommodation, so if you're looking for more of a social experience, then it could be a good one to go for. Close by to Lupton you also have James Bailey, and I don't know if this still is the case, but at least in my first year of uni, James Bailey was very much the party accommodation. I don't really know much about the rooms or the price or anything because I've personally never visited it, but it's once again closer to Headingley, and next to it, or at least very close to it, is one called North Hill Court. Once again, don't really know a lot about this one. I think it's a bit of a smaller accommodation. Also out Headingley way we have one called Devonshire, and Devonshire is a bit of a strange accommodation in the sense that it's really pretty. It looks like it could be taken out of Oxford or Cambridge, and I'm pretty sure this is a catered accommodation, although I think there are self-catered rooms as well. Coming onto campus now, we have Charles Morris, and this is the biggest accommodation that's on campus, and because of that, I think it's also one of the most expensive. They have catered rooms and potentially self-catered rooms, but don't quote me on that. But all I really know about this one is it's expensive. Also on campus we have one called LSE Global Residence, and as the name suggests, I think this is primarily for international students, but once again that could be wrong. There's also one on campus called Liddon Hall, and I think this one is slightly smaller but catered and kind of expensive once again because of the location of it. There's nothing necessarily wrong with any of these accommodations, I'm just pointing out that because they're on campus they're more expensive. Kind of on the edge of campus we have Henry Price, and Henry Price was a very close second for me just because the location is so good, and I think in comparison to other on-campus accommodations it's not as expensive, although that could have changed in recent years. The only thing with Henry Price is they had a very interesting toilet situation with a lot of the rooms. So the bathrooms are essentially Jack and Jill bathrooms, I think that's what they're called. So you have one bathroom kind of in the middle of two rooms, and then both rooms have a door that opens up into it, so it's essentially an ensuite that two people share. Not that that put me off or anything, I think that would have been fine, and I think you're always put with a person of the same sex, but just an interesting fact about that one. Then we have Central Village and Cityside, and these ones are a little bit further down the road into the city centre, but the location is so good because you're super close to campus and super close to the city centre. These were really popular when I was in my first year of uni. I had a lot of friends in Central Village, so I'd go there quite a lot, and the flats were really nice, really modern. I think kind of more expensive, but I feel like you pay for what you get with Central Village. Cityside is the exact same location as Central Village. I think it's just next door, but it's more expensive. But the flats were super modern, super soundproof actually, so good for prees, although I don't think I should be promoting that. So those are the actual University of Leeds accommodations, but then there's also a lot of private accommodation in the city as well. For example, there's one called White Rose that I think is a Unite Students accommodation, and this wasn't open when I was in my first year of uni. I think it was built since then, but this one, as far as I've seen and heard, is very popular. It's like a big high-rise building in the city centre, so really good location if you go out a lot or you're spending a lot of time in the city centre. And there are a lot more than that, but unfortunately those are the only ones that I really know any information about. So I would still encourage you to do your own research, because there could be one that's perfect for you but just isn't on that list. So something that I didn't answer in my last Q&A, because I just hadn't got to that stage of my uni experience yet, is what's the second year accommodation like and the third year accommodation. So I thought I would talk about that. So there's two main student areas in Leeds. You've got one called Hyde Park and one called Headingley. I just mentioned Headingley a lot when talking about first year accommodation because there's quite a few based there, and Headingley is a little bit further out from campus. So if the city centre is here, you've got campus just north of it here, and then kind of northwest to it is Headingley. And I personally really like Headingley. I think it's a really nice area. It's got a really nice high street. You've got a big Sainsbury's there, Wilko's, Boots, Superdrug, and the student houses that are there, from what I've seen, tend to be slightly bigger, more suburb kind of houses. And that's because it's about a 25-minute, half an hour walk from campus and a 45-minute to an hour walk to Leeds city centre, so it's quite far out of the city centre. But there are buses that run the whole way from Headingley down to the campus and down to the city centre, so transport isn't really a problem. Then you have Hyde Park, and Hyde Park is a lot closer to campus. It's probably around a 15-20 minute walk depending on where you live in Hyde Park, and it's much more of a inner city area, so it's mainly terraced houses and the streets are a lot narrower. There's not really any gardens, whereas in Headingley, from what I've seen of houses, they have a bit more space because it's further out. So most Uni of Leeds students live in Hyde Park just because it is a lot closer to the campus. So it's just very much a typical student area. It's definitely not the worst area, but it's also not the best. I had a few questions saying, is it as bad as I've heard it is? Because there are a few horror stories that have come out of Hyde Park, but I feel like that's the case with any student area. Unfortunately, because it's well known that it's a student area, it does get more targeted. But I have personally never had a problem living here, and neither has anyone that I've known. So as long as you're being safe and you're taking precautions, most people that I know have been absolutely fine living here. I would just really encourage anyone coming on an open day to Leeds to also have a look at Hyde Park and Headingley, because this isn't something that I ever did on an open day, but in hindsight wish that I had, because I think you spend so much time worrying about where you're going to live in your first year that you forget about where you're going to live after that. And if your uni is anything like Leeds, you spend more time living in the student area than you do in your first year accommodation. So it's definitely worth going and having a look and seeing if it's somewhere that you like the look of and you'd feel comfortable living in. And most people, when they live in Hyde Park or they live in Headingley, they'll live in a shared house, and this can range from from a 2-person house to a 15-person house. There are some huge houses here. And I don't know if this is the same at other universities, but there's a real pressure to sign for a house really quickly in your first year of uni. However, I wanted to briefly talk about this because I think some estate agents do this deliberately to sign first year students on quickly. Because I remember when I moved to Leeds, within a month people were talking about where they were going to live in their second year, who they were going to live with. They'd already started looking at houses, and it creates this kind of frantic atmosphere around finding a second and a third year house. And I think estate agents really egg first year students on, because you'll go on viewings and they'll be saying things like, they're going so quickly, we've got hardly any houses left. Whereas the reality is that I'm pretty sure, but don't quote me on this, there's usually a surplus of student houses compared to the number of students. So even though it seems like there's this massive rush to sign for a house really quickly, there isn't really that rush. For example, when I was in my first year of uni, I think we essentially got duped or scammed or pressured wrongly into signing for the house that we did, because they showed us some really bad houses. So by the time it got to the end of this viewing and we'd seen about 6 different properties, the last one that we'd seen seemed like the best of a bad bunch, so we just signed for it, I'm pretty sure, that same evening. And this was in about December of first year, so I'd only been in Leeds for a few months. But then once I'd moved into that house and I was visiting friends at other houses, some of my friends, especially ones in older years, had much nicer houses that they had signed months after we had. And I don't know if maybe estate agents take advantage of the fact that first year students don't really know that much about student properties or have never signed for a house before, or if it was just a coincidence and I had a bad experience. But basically what I'm trying to say is, don't succumb to what the estate agents are saying. There's likely not the rush and the pressure that they're saying that there is, especially as you go up the years and you're in your third year or your fourth year. You'll find that most people actually do sign for a house much later on. For example, some of my housemates that are staying on in Leeds only signed for their house, I think, last month, so April or May. Okay, enough about accommodation. The next question is, what is the city centre like? So I'm not really sure how to describe Leeds apart from the fact that it's quite a typical UK city. Like I said, I'm from Nottingham, and to me Leeds just feels like a slightly bigger version of Nottingham. It's definitely not as big as places like Manchester or Birmingham, but I'd actually say it's a pretty nice size. You can easily walk to the city centre and walk all around the city centre, and especially the bit right in the middle is mostly pedestrian. It's pretty good for shopping, it's got loads of restaurants, cafes, it's got pretty much everything you would want from a city centre, I think. Saying all of that, I didn't actually go into the city centre as much as I thought I would during my time at uni. I went quite a lot in my first year because I went out a lot more clubbing and just generally did more activities in the city centre, but especially this last year during my final year, I pretty much never go in unless I'm going to a shop, running an errand, have an appointment. But it is nice having it that close for when I just want to go in quickly and do something. I got a few questions about the safety of the city centre, and once again this is going to be a very subjective thing. To me it's no safer or unsafe than Nottingham city centre. Once again, you've just got to remain kind of vigilant and aware of your surroundings, especially on days where it's a bit busier. But I've personally never had a problem, and I don't think any of my friends have ever had a problem in the city centre. The next question is, what's Freshers Week like? So it has been 4 years since I was a fresher, so it could be completely different now. But at least when I came to Leeds, the vibe of Freshers Week was was very much let's go out every single night. Leeds has a reputation of being more of a party city, so I feel like when people come here, and especially first move here and it's Freshers Week, they expect to want to go out. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but it's definitely something to bear in mind. And I just kind of went along with it when I first got to uni. I didn't go out every night, but I think I went out 5 times or something, and I don't remember any of those nights being a particularly good night out. But then again, I don't like drinking or clubbing. I was just trying to convince myself back then that I did like it. But if that is your vibe, Leeds in general has great nightlife. There's so many clubs, so many bars. There's literally something for everyone here. The only thing I'd say is don't get a wristband. I don't know if they're really a big thing anymore, but when I was in my first year, promoters were trying to push wristbands on us all the time. And I don't want to wrongly accuse anyone, but I'm pretty sure they're a scam because they're really expensive for what they are. And most of the time, the nights on them, the club nights, are not the same club nights that everyone else is going to be going to. The Freshers Week that I had ended up being a very spontaneous week. We just decided where we were going dependent on where everyone else was going to at the prees, because there were a few occasions where I'd bought a club night ticket weeks in advance, get to the prees, and then everyone's going somewhere different, so we ended up buying a second club ticket. So my advice would be just leave it closer to the time, see what the vibe is closer to the time, and then decide what you actually want to go to. I'd also encourage you to check out the stuff that's happening on campus as well, because I met more people going to the on-campus things than I did going to any club nights. There's so many people that I met in club toilets and in nightclubs who you think you get on with really well, but it's not often the best way to make good friends. Freshers Fair is also definitely worth going to. It's basically a big kind of exhibition. It's normally in a big tent and all different societies have stalls, and it's a great way to kind of see the different clubs and societies that the uni offers. I was going to answer this question later, but I feel like I'm kind of on the roll of talking about it now, and that's what's the best way to socialize and make friends. And I'd say that getting involved in societies is probably one of the best ways to meet people. There's kind of different ways and streams of people that you can meet at uni. So there'll be the people that you're in an accommodation with, there'll be people that you study the same thing as, and then there'll be people that you meet at societies, and then just people that you meet through people. So the main society that I joined in my first year was the Business School Society. So this is essentially the society for my academic subject, and at Leeds there is normally a society for every academic subject. And I thought the Business School Society in my first year was great because it was an amazing way to meet people that I had either seen in lectures and seminars and not spoken to, or to kind of reinforce those initial conversations that I'd had with people in a lecture, in the business school, in a seminar. But as well as joining one for your academic subject, I would also recommend joining some for just general interests, because I think it's also important to have friends that don't necessarily study the same thing as you. So societies that I've really enjoyed are the Yoga Society, although that's not as social, but I just really liked yoga. I also liked Art Society. I was very briefly a part of Vertical Fitness, which is pole dancing, but there are honestly so many at Leeds. I think there's over 300. Someone told me at one point. Also, one of the main ways that I made friends is just introducing myself to people during lectures and during seminars. That's how I met most of my close friends in the business school, actually. You do just have to bite the bullet with these situations, and it might not be the most comfortable situation initially, but especially if it's right at the start of uni. Everyone is in the same boat. Everyone wants to make friends, so everyone is secretly hoping that someone comes up to them and starts a conversation. The next question is one about discovery modules and what I'd recommend picking for discovery modules, and I'm pretty sure that I didn't talk about this in my last Q&A. So at Leeds, the academic year is made up of 120 credits, and each module that you do is worth a number of credits. It's normally 10 credits or 20 credits depending on how long the module is. And for most courses, you have 100 credits of your course content modules, but then for some courses you also have 20 credits which are allocated to something called discovery modules. And basically with those 20 credits you can pick any discovery module offered by any school within the university. So for example, last year Sid did a 20 credit German module, so he did a language. I've done a politics discovery module before. I've done a climate change module which is from the School of Earth and Environment. I did a philosophy module which was obviously from the School of Philosophy. So it's a chance for you to basically broaden what you're studying and potentially do something that's not taught by your school. However, the only thing that I would say about that is when I have done modules that have been quite far out from what I usually study, the assignments are typically harder because, for example, for philosophy has a very distinct way of writing an essay and a very different expectation of what that essay will look like compared to the business school. I think it also has a different referencing style. So whilst the content of a discovery module might be really interesting, as was the case with the ones that I did, it's worth bearing in mind what the expectations for the assignment are going to be, because a lot of the time it might end up taking up more time than other modules. So instead this year I just took a discovery module within the business school, so it was something that wasn't on the core syllabus of my subject. It was called Gender and Equality, so it was more of a kind of sociology based module, but it still had the same assignment criteria and marking scheme as my other modules, so it felt a lot more manageable and fit in with my other studies a lot more. I thought I would also talk briefly about the dissertation process because this is obviously something that I have recently done. So this is going to be different for different subjects, but the way that it works in business is your dissertation makes up 40 credits of the academic year, so it's essentially a 40 credit module, and it functions in a similar way to other modules in that we had lectures for our dissertation which essentially talked us through the process of writing one. So we had a lecture on the literature review, a lecture on methodology, on data analysis. So at every step they did talk us through what we were supposed to be doing, and at the same time as that you also get allocated a dissertation supervisor. So at the start of your final year you will submit a dissertation proposal, which is essentially the idea that you have for a dissertation. You'll just have to write a little bit about it and which kind of data collection method and analysis you're thinking of doing, and then based on that information you will get matched with a supervisor. However, my matching process didn't go too well because I was doing a quantitative dissertation and got put with a qualitative supervisor, but essentially didn't realise until it was too late. And your supervisor is there to help you throughout the year. You can book up to 5 hours of meetings with them, or at least that's the case in the business school. There are other forms of support available though, because my supervisor was qualitative, for example. I had quite a lot of meetings with the statistics team in the library. So these are a team of people that aren't subject specific but can help you with things like statistics. I think they also have math support, general writing support. But apart from that, your dissertation is very much a self-guided, self-disciplined project. You are solely responsible for doing everything essentially. So it's definitely a massive learning curve. It's definitely a challenge, because I like knowing that what I'm doing is correct whilst I'm doing it, and that's not really the case with a dissertation. You've got to make your own judgments. Someone asked, do you recommend doing a study abroad year? So between my second year and my third year, I took an optional study abroad year, and once again, whether this is optional or compulsory will depend on what you're studying. For example, if you're studying a language, study abroad years are normally compulsory, but for the business school you had the option of doing a study abroad year or something called a year in industry, where you work for a year on a placement in a company. And I chose to do a study abroad year just because I am already self-employed, so didn't necessarily want to work full-time for a year on top of that, and I'm very fortunate that I did have the funds and the opportunity to do a study abroad year. So between my second year and my third year, I went off to Copenhagen, and it meant that my degree was essentially 4 years long instead of 3 years long. The year didn't actually count for anything though. I just had to pass the year overall. It doesn't actually count towards the final grade that I graduate with. But I would really recommend doing something like this if you have the opportunity during your degree, because personally I wouldn't have felt ready to graduate anyway just after 3 years. I'm really glad that I did extend it to 4. This has felt like kind of the perfect amount of time at uni. But having said that, it's definitely worth looking into the costs of especially a study abroad year, because it is quite an expensive process. I do have a whole video about study abroad though. I will link it up wherever the little tag comes up, because there are quite a lot of things to consider when applying for one. Quite a few people asked about the best study spots, so I thought I'd talk about my personal favourites on campus and off campus. There are so many places to study on campus. I am just a creature of habit, so I always went back to the same ones, but there's obviously the libraries, and the 2 libraries that I always went to is Laidlaw and Edward Boyle, or Eddie B as everyone calls it. So Eddie B is probably the main library, I would say. It's right on campus and it can be quite social. It gets quite busy, but it does have lovely seats. I especially really like the ones that look over the windows. And then my other favourite was Laidlaw, which is on the edge of campus and feels a little bit more modern and has really nice views, especially if you're on the 3rd floor. Then there's also quite a few cafes on campus, so there's loads of Cafe Neros for some reason. I don't know if they're associated with Cafe Nero, but my favourite ones were the Cafe Nero in Roger Stevens. That one's lovely, and also the one in the business school is really nice. The business school also has quite a big study space, I think it's called, at the top of the building on the 2nd floor, I think, and I always worked there quite often, but it does get quite busy there quite quickly. I get quite a lot of questions about how do you actually find seats on campus, because pretty much everywhere gets busy really quickly, and the only answer is that you've got to get there fairly early in the morning. If you're getting there at like 9-10 o'clock, you'll obviously have a much better chance of finding a seat than if you're getting there at midday. The only way you're really going to find a seat at around midday is if someone is leaving at the same time, so you won't really have the same choice of seats as you will earlier on in the day. I don't know if this is just a Leeds problem, but there's just generally a lack of spaces to sit on campus. Everywhere always seems to get busy so quickly, especially during exam season and deadline season. You honestly want to get there first thing in the morning, otherwise you're just not getting a good seat. However, having said that, there are lots of computer clusters all over campus. There's quite a lot in the business school campus as well that normally aren't as busy, so it's worth having a look at those. I think there's a map on the University of Leeds website of all of these different study spaces. And also Esther Simpson Cafe. Esther Simpson is a new building that recently opened up and it's got a lovely cafe area in there. And then, to be honest, I didn't really study outside of campus in the city centre that often because I lived closer to campus than I did the city centre. So if I did study in the centre. I would normally just study in a chain coffee shop. Once again, there's loads of Cafe Neros. Maybe it's just a Leeds thing that we've got so many here, but there's some nice Cafe Neros, there's some nice Starbucks with working spaces. But then there are coffee shops that I like in Leeds I just haven't worked in before. So if you're into coffee, then these are some places that you should definitely check out. We have Bowery and Fika North, which are both in Headingley. Coffee on the Crescent, which is in Hyde Park. A place called Woolfox, which is in the city centre. If up north, and Mrs. Athers, which are all in the city centre as well. And then the final question that I'm going to end this Q&A on is, what are your favourite day trips outside of Leeds? So I really haven't been on as many day trips as I wanted to go on, because there are so many gorgeous countryside areas outside of Leeds. You can drive in less than an hour and be in the Yorkshire Dales. But some day trips that I have done that are definitely worth having a look at is Ilkley Moor. Go to Ilkley. It's a gorgeous little town. Village. It's just a really nice area and it's a lovely walk up to Ilkley Moor. There's a really nice pub at the top there. I think it's called Cow Calf, something like that. So stop and have a drink there. Also head to York for a day trip. That's a really nice area. And then apart from that, there's just loads of nice little walks that you can do in the Yorkshire Dales if you can drive out there or get transport out there. So that is everything for this video. I hope that I have covered everything in enough depth, and I really hope that this was useful to anyone looking at the University of Leeds. Overall, I would really recommend it. I have just finished my 4 years here and have honestly really enjoyed it. So if you did find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And also follow me on my Instagram and my TikTok for lots more of additional content. Bye!